The Grays Park that we know is now 100 years old. When we go for a stroll in the park, we see so many familiar things. From the very paths that we are walking on, to the landmarks that we pass. The bowling green. The tennis courts. The lakes. The Rose Garden Cafe. The Animal Farm. The open parkland vistas. They all give us an impression of permanence, but this could not be further from the truth. The park has over 1,000 years of documented history, and during this time it has seen many major changes. Around 1000 AD, the owner of the area that we know as Grays Park was the Anglo-Saxon nobleman, Wulfric Spot. He would however have used the word hays instead of park. The word park was brought to us by the Normans after the conquest, but as we shall see, the meaning of the word has changed considerably over time. His title was more correctly, Wulfric Spot of Alfreton. Alfreton being where his main residence was. His family had intermarried with the Norwegian royal family, and was one of the most powerful of the nobles at the time. His will, endorsed by King Ethelred, tells us that he had land in 10 counties and more in the unshired Wirral and Liverpool areas. Looking at the modern map, we can see that the northern boundary of his lands were watercourses. Firstly, by the Lim Brook, then along the River Sheaf past Millhouses to Healy, and then up the Mersbrook, past Gleadless Town End and on to the Shire Brook. The park in his day would probably have been much larger than we are familiar with today. This ancient boundary would endure for nearly 1,000 years as the Yorkshire, Derbyshire county boundary. When it did eventually change, it would be the trigger that created the park as we know it today. His hall would probably have been on the site of the current Norton Hall. This location has several important features that make it ideal. Most important is security. On the top of the hill it gives early warning of any approaching threat. Secondly, water, there are ample springs in the area. Thirdly, the gentle sloping land to the south would be ideal for agriculture. The first hall was most probably of cruck construction. The name cruck derives from the naturally curving tree trunks that were split and used to build the main frame of the building. The curved crooks can be seen in the end gable of this sketch. The infill between the wooden frame would have been from wattle and daub. There would probably have been 3 bays. The centre bay would be the actual hall, sometimes referred to as the Great Hall. This is where we derive the name now used for the whole building. It was the area where guests, who were not members of his family or close friends, were met and entertained. We still have halls in modern houses where we greet visitors, but unlike today, it would have been a very large room with an open fire in the middle, and a hole in the roof for the smoke to escape. Guests would be able to sit, eat, and be entertained there. The surrounding park would be the Lord's private domain. Parks were often referred to as the deer parks. This gives a clue to one of the main functions of the park. Not as you may imagine for hunting, as depicted here. This shows the demise of Lord William Rufus in the New Forest during a deer hunt. No, the deer were farmed for food, rather like modern cattle. Seen here, Beechief Hall still has its deer park. Usually the deer were enclosed by digging a ditch and then building a mound next to the ditch with the spoil. The mound was then capped with a wooden fence or stone wall. Signs of this sort of ditch enclosure have been found in Graves Park. Deer favored open grassland with some woodland. The wooded area was usually holly bushes, as these could be used as winter fodder for the deer and other animals. The deer would not normally be hunted. They were either driven into a small enclosure, or towards the wooded area, where archers were concealed. Deer were not slaughtered over the winter period, and so only salted venison would be available. To overcome this shortfall, the other major source of protein was fish. Fish farming had been perfected for religious reasons, by the monks in the abbeys and monasteries. There would typically be 3 lakes, just as we see in Graves Park today. One pond would be for breeding. Another pond would be a holding pond where the fish large enough for eating would be kept. This was referred to as a stew pond. Prior to eating, the fish, usually perch, would be kept in a clear pool, or a section of clear running water for a few days, to clear the muddy flavor from the flesh. There would definitely have been some hunting, but it would probably have been falconry and hare coursing. Later maps show that area of the park to the left of the path from Charles Ashmore Road to the lakes was called Hare Hills. There would also have been extensive paddocks and meadows to support the variety of horses and oxen needed. Later maps shown this as being between the hall and the lakes, and between the lakes and where the Rose Garden Cafe is now. However, with land tenure there came obligation. For a lord such as Wulfric, this obligation was to the king. The next 600 years would be very turbulent times, with on average a war every 4 years. These were either major strife with our Scottish or Welsh neighbours, internal wars, or wars abroad. The nature of this obligation for Wulfric and future lords of the manor would be to serve as a knight, and also to bring along a number of men at arms and archers. This gives the clue to the park's other main function. The park would be a training ground where knights, men at arms and archers could be trained. Some parks had tilt yards, where jousting with lances on horseback took place. This training was a very serious business. We think of knights being clumsy in their full armor, but typically a knight would be able to vault onto his horse in armor that weighed about 50 pounds. Surprisingly, even after the Norman conquest, the manor of Norton was still held by a Saxon lord. Most prominent of these was Robert Fitz Ranulph, who would found Beechief Abbey and Norton Church. He was also famous, or perhaps infamous, for being the sheriff of Nottingham of Robin Hood fame. Over the coming centuries, as the male lines died out, several different families would own the estate, and frequently it would be split up and then reconnected. In the 1400s and 1500s, it would further be split by leasing land out to an increasing number of yeoman farmers. The Elizabethan era, in the second half of the 16th century, brought a time of relative peace and prosperity. It is thought that this was when the first hall of stone construction was built. It has the traditional E-shaped frontage. With the coming of the Georgian era, in the 1700s, there was another period of relative peace and prosperity. It is marked by the start of the Industrial Revolution, the formation of Great Britain in 1707, and the expansion of the British Empire. London boomed as a global commercial hub. In 1759, Samuel Shaw, the wealthy ironmaster, married Judith Offley, and so came into possession of the Norton estate through marriage. His family were one of the wealthiest in Sheffield. They were quarrymen and stone masons, and it was they who had been paid to dismantle and dispose of the stonework from Sheffield Castle, which had sided with the Royalists during the Civil War. He rebuilt the Elizabethan Norton Hall into the hall we see today. Prior to his ownership, the main London to Sheffield Road ran from Dykes Lane, along Little Norton Lane, straight through the middle of the park to Bowl Hill, and on to Sheffield. Anyone standing in Little Norton Lane would likely have seen a coach and horses passing by. In the background where the Graves Trust houses are, there used to be much older buildings that were part of the hamlet of Little Norton. It is thought that amongst them, there was a hostelry where there was a change of horses. Looking at the 1800 map, we see that the western part of the park is largely tenanted, notably by the Biggins family. With his wealth, Samuel Shaw was able to bring the park back into a single entity. The old road through the park shown in yellow was closed. A new turnpike road, which we know as Meadowhead, was created. This is shown in red. A new way to the hall from Meadowhead was created, shown in orange. The first section of this would later become Charles Ashmore Road. This was the era of Capability Brown, and it is Samuel Shaw who is credited as being responsible for greatly extending and opening out the grounds around the hall, forming the estate into a landscape of beautiful parkland of the sort that we recognize today. On their half-mile coach ride from Meadowhead, along his newly built driveway, guests coming to visit him would no doubt be very impressed by the hall and its setting. This golden period ended in 1843, when the Shaw family banking business collapsed. The estate was put up for sale in 1850. It would pass through a series of owners, until in 1902, Colonel B. A. Firth purchased the estate. He was a prominent Sheffield industrialist and son of steel manufacturer Mark Firth. Colonel Firth was effectively lord of the manor of a sizable private country estate. He no doubt felt that same sense of obligation that had existed for almost 1,000 years, as once again, he set up butts on the estate. The butts were set up in the quarry, that is close to Meadowhead, but this time the butts would be for riflemen, not archers. This was a very prescient decision, for in 1914, the drums of war sounded once more. Across the land, men from the country estate similar to Norton answered the call. From earls to under gardeners, they marched off to the fields of Flanders. Many would return to their village in name only, engraved on the war memorial. The industrial slaughter of the Great War, together with the steep decline in agriculture that occurred in the late 1800s, would end the near-feudal system that had been maintained by the great country estates for 1,000 years. During the war, the hall had been requisitioned by the War Department for use by the officers from the nearby RFC Cole Aston Landing Ground. Colonel Firth would never return to the estate after the war. He was to be the last owner of the wider estate. This picture shows a significant contributory reason. It is the Sheffield City Council, Olive Grove Works Depot, in the early 20th century. It shows piles of paving slabs and sewer pipes, ready to create the urban sprawl that is Sheffield today. What had been the city boundary for over 1,000 years at Heeley would be pushed out to where the boundary is today, close to Cole Aston. In 1925, Colonel Firth started to sell off his land, including Norton Hall. A white knight was desperately needed, and this came in the form of J.G. Graves. J.G. Graves, born in the Victorian era, was a very wealthy, self-made man and philanthropist. He was also one of Sheffield Corporation's aldermen. He realized that people needed green spaces to escape the spreading urbanization, and was able to purchase the land that we now call Graves Park, and then gift it to the corporation. Before the park was open to the public, extensive work was carried out, creating the network of paths that we are familiar with today. Here, we see the Lord Mayor and Lady Mayoress, accompanied by Councillor and Mrs. J.G. Graves at the official opening on June 3, 1926. J.G. Graves' purchase did not include Norton Hall, and so after over 1,000 years the hall was separated from its park. The hall, together with a parcel of land, had been bought by the Sheffield Joint Hospital Board, with a view to creating a major hospital site. This never materialised, and eventually the hall passed into private hands, and is now split into flats. This, however, may have saved it. In the 1960s, the Sheffield City Council cared little for the fine historic buildings in its care. Many were demolished and lost forever, including its near neighbours, Green Hill Hall and Lees Hall. Since 1999, the Friends of Graves Park charity has assisted other trusts with interests in Graves Park, in enhancing and maintaining the park for leisure, education and conservation, in conjunction with the local community, and helps to preserve the flora and fauna for the benefit and enjoyment of the park users. The restoration of the Rose Garden Cafe is one of their current projects. Graves Park, the largest municipal park in Sheffield, attracts thousands of visitors from across the city region each year. They still come to enjoy its beautiful parkland and varied sporting activities. In this centenary year, the vision of J.G. Graves lives on.